I learned early that glass listens before it obeys. You think you are the one shaping it, turning, gathering, breathing, yet the molten drop at the end of your pipe. Here's the tremor in your wrist, the doubt in your lungs, the stray thought that flares and vanishes like a spark. If you bring yourself to the furnace as a storm, it storms back. If you bring yourself as still water, it clears enough to show you your face. That morning I arrived before anyone else, the lagoon still lavender with unmade decisions. The workshop shutters were dark, slatted ribs against a sleeping street. Marana wakes like old cats, reluctantly, with a slow stretch and a soft complaint. But I liked the island before it remembered its name. No tourists yet, no glass animals multiplying in windows only. The fairies cough in the distance, and the thin cry of a gull. I unlatched the door, pressed my palm against the cool iron, and stepped inside. I love the smell first, warm sand, burnt breath, and a sweetness like singed orange peel. The furnaces hummed, doors latched to keep the heart inside. I tapped the side of no, too, with the back of my knuckles. Habit, respect, superstition, and watched the pyrometer numbers glow up like a sunrise. Working heat. I breathed out, and the sound came back to me, the long, low sigh of a consort without words. I lit the bench lamp, looped my hair in a knot, and chalked my plan for the day. 5 vases, 3 trials for the chandelier commission. 1 experiment with a color bar I'd been hoarding like a secret. I drew circles, arrows, notes only I could read. Around me the tools waited as if they'd been left mid-sentence: jacks, shears, paddles, tweezers, all cold tongues ready to taste fire. When I opened the furnace door, the heat folded me in its arms. I'm small, but at the mouth of the furnace I have the feeling of being seen and trusted by something enormous. Gather, turn, re-enter, turn. You make a small planet at the end of your pipe, and persuade it to spin. When the glow steadied, I crossed to the marver and rolled the gather smooth. Listening to that whispering truth, glass tells anyone honest enough to hear it. Not yet, now. I blew softly, cheeks barely full, and in the smallening globe I saw the day arrange itself. A woman in a black coat who always came at 10 to ask if I could repair her grandmother's lamp. A boy on a scooter dragging his shoe. A shadow in the doorway that would sharpen into a man I had once thought I'd never forgive. But at 8:30, it was just me, and the glow, and the promise of a shape. I set the first piece in the annealer and reached for the color bar. Lagoon blue. A tone I never sold because it looked too much like a memory. Self-indulgent, my master would say, and laugh from the back of his throat. He had hands like paddles and a voice like a kettle. He died one spring with cherry petals on his coat, and I still catch myself saving questions for him. I wanted to ask him, for example, how you keep making beautiful things when the person you love is half returned to someone else's light. But I already knew his answer. You keep turning. The bell on the door clinked at 9. I didn't look up. The locals knock on the glass. The tourists stand in the middle with their arms folded like they're about to be folded into a gondola. And the dealers come talking into their phones. The sound that entered was none of those. It was a careful silence. I knew that silence as if it were my own shadow. Good morning, he said, the carefulness like a napkin on a lap. Good morning, I answered, and didn't turn. Half the island had a version of him, the man who smiles with his whole attention, the man who can read a contract like the sea reads a shoreline, the man who steps onto the vaporetto and is instantly bracketed by glances. But only I had the version who fell asleep with a case file on his chest and woke in the middle of my bed saying another woman's name once. Like a foreign word he was trying on for weight. He had apologized in the morning with the ferocity of a lawyer cross-examining a regret. I had put a glass of water on his side of the table and watched light shiver on the surface. I turned then, pipe balanced on the arms of the bench, and let myself look. He was in his sea coat, the one with the turned-up collar and a single loose thread at the cuff that he worried without knowing. His hair had a little more winter in it. He had not slept well, though he looked like a good night pressed into a suit. I brought coffee, he said, offering the paper cup with 2 fingers, as if he might not be allowed to touch more than that. Put it by the jacks, I said, because old affections need somewhere safe to stand. He lingered, the way smoke does in doorways. You're working on the chandelier. Yes, for the palazzo, yes. We had learned a new grammar, nouns without adjectives, answers without invitations. He came closer, careful with the boundary I had chalked 6 weeks ago. That chalk still dusted our lives. He stopped where the chalk would have been. I got an email last night, he said. There it was, the small wind that changes the shape of a flame. I said, turning the pipe, letting the thing at the end keep its own center. She's coming to Venice, he said gently, as if you were setting down a bowl that might crack if it heard its own name. For the festival, readings in town, then a panel about the ethics of salvaged words. I finished for him, because once I had read every interview, every article, every poem with a dog at the edge of the frame. I know. He looked surprised and then ashamed. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it mattered. That's not an excuse. It's not, I agreed. But I accept it as a sentence. He smiled without pleasure. A short one, subject implied, I said, and then I did smile. Because this was the language we had spoken before grief and poetry complicated it. He stepped forward and I slid the gather into the furnace, breaking the moment like a surface. The door shut with a breath, and we stood in the warm echo. You don't have to go, I said to the glass. The heat answered my face. You don't have to hear her say the old words in a new room. I know, he said behind me. I don't have to do anything. That's what scares me. I pulled the pipe and rolled again, dusting the globe with chips of blue that caught and swam. Through the shine I saw us reflected, small figures bent over a sun. You will go, I said. Because it is a promise you made to yourself. He exhaled, a sound of being named. You know me too well. I know the shape you make, I said. People are glass. They remember the hands that first turned them. He didn't answer. When I lifted the jacks, the piece opened like a mouth about to say something it would regret. I coaxed it wider, then narrower, then gave it that sharp elliptical tilt my buyers called marine elegance and my master had called finally. The old, dumb pleasure of making steadied me. For 3 minutes I think of nothing but heat and torque, and fractionally different pressures. When at last I could see the vase it wanted to be, I snapped the neck and let it go to the annealer, where cooling is a slow education. He watched my hands the way a thirsty person watches a glass. When I looked up, his cuff thread had been wound around his finger, a small tourniquet for indecision. She sent a book, he said. A new one. I waited. Inscribed, he added, aware of the old wound he was describing, the way we hold our scars like maps. She said she'll bring me something else in person. A fragment? From a wreck I worked on last year. The china, I said. I had heard the story of the plates that had laid a century in a silk cathedral, the way the shells had rimmed themselves in pink. He had come home from that case, sea-brined, and smiling like a child who had stolen a tide. He softened, remembering. It's nothing. A cup that won't hold water. I told her it belongs to the museum, and she laughed and said, then I'll bring you a story, counselor. His voice dropped into her imitation. It wasn't unkind, but my body leaned back, as if from a heat too close. She will bring you many stories, I said. That is what she does. He nodded. For a while we listened to the small, sincere sounds workshops make, when they believe no one is judging them. The tap of a tool slipping back a centimeter, the faint pop of a bubble surrendering in the annealer, the coils whispering to themselves about duty. I came to tell you, he said finally. Because I didn't want you to hear it from a poster on the Vaporetto dock. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. He had never lied to me. He had simply, once, been honest in his sleep. The bell clinked again. The woman in the black coat arrived early, the lamp cradled in her arms like a cooled loaf. I wiped my hands and took it from her, peering into the throat where the seam had unzipped. 2 days, I promised. She pressed my fingers as if I had taken pulse. When the woman left, he was standing by the door, the paper cup empty by the jacks. The chalk line between us was old. I could step over it, and I almost did out of muscle memory. But in the smudge of ash on the floor, I saw something the furnace had been trying to teach me for weeks. Some cracks spread when you heat them. Some close. The trick is knowing what you want. You'll go, I said again, not unkindly. And you'll listen. and you'll come back knowing what you hear when the room is quiet." He looked at me like a drowning man looks at shore, afraid of what being saved costs. "Will you be here?" "I will be where my work is," I said. "Where my life is." "And is that here?" I said. It felt good to say a word that wasn't improvised. He nodded. He didn't ask for more than I had given. This was one of the things I loved about him, and one of the reasons I was preparing to love him less. He stepped out onto the street, the door latch making its tiny marriage sound. Through the shutters I watched the day come up quick, the canal glittering like broken bottles smoothed by time. I went back to the bench and reached for the color bar again. The shade looked like a promise you give yourself when no one is listening. I nicked off a sliver and let it fall into the heat, where it brightened and softened and decided to be part of something else. Outside, the ferry hooted. Across the canal, a dog barked twice like a punctuation mark. And somewhere on the mainland, a poster was being taped to a wall. The poet's face. The date, the hour, the word return in a font that thought too highly of itself. I turned the pipe, gathering another small planet. I blew, and the breath went where breath goes, into shape, into effort, into the mouth of something that would one day hold flowers. I couldn't see the future through it, not yet. But when I tilted the glass just so, the blue ran like water in a memory, and I knew the chapter had begun. Sunday in Murano carries a peculiar stillness, as if the whole island has forgotten the rhythm of commerce. No clinking of tools, no clatter of gondoliers, shouting prices across the canal and Lee, the hush of water kissing stone. It's the only day my furnaces rest, and yet I never truly do. My hands twitch for the weight of the pipe, my lungs for the breath that shapes, my heart for something to cool before it cracks. So I walked instead. The ferry from Fondamenta Nuove glided across the lagoon, its motor a sleepy hum, leaving behind a silver scar on the surface. I liked standing on deck alone, scarf over my hair, watching how the horizon kept rearranging itself. To the west, the mainland smudged into mist. To the east, Venice glittered like a memory that refused to fade. He found me there once, months before the silence, before the poet returned like an old tide. I remember the first time clearly. He was reading court papers, even as the sea rocked us both. He looked absurdly formal against the soft chaos of gulls. I'd laughed, and he'd looked up, startled, as if laughter were an unfamiliar sound on water. Now, with him away on the mainland, preparing for the poet's arrival, no doubt I stood in that same spot, and the absence felt heavier than presence. The railing was cold beneath my palms. The air carried the faint sweetness of salt and diesel. I took out the small sketchbook I kept in my coat pocket. Between pressed receipts and bits of charcoal, dust lay pages of designs, curves, prisms, chandeliers, like captured waves. On the newest page, I had drawn a shape that didn't yet make sense, half tear, perhaps it was both. A fisherman nodded as I passed, and I waved. His nets gleamed like veins. "Buon domenica," he said, smiling with only half his mouth. I returned the greeting, and kept walking until the narrow alleys opened into a square lined with silent shops. Their windows displayed frozen seas of glass, swans and dolphins, all gleaming under dust. Beauty trapped, like breath held too long. At the corner cafe, Signora Dalco was arranging chairs. She waved me in. "You work too much," she scolded as soon as I sat. "Your eyes look like unpolished glass." "Work keeps me honest," I said. "Work keeps you lonely," she countered, pouring me thick coffee. "Men like him don't notice what they leave behind until someone else picks it up." I didn't ask how she knew, but she'd seen the lawyer come and go, always polite, always carrying files heavier than flowers. "He'll be back," she said softly. "They always come back." "Sometimes," I said, stirring sugar that refused to dissolve. "Coming back changes nothing." She hummed, unconvinced. Outside, a bell tolled 11. The ferry moaned like a creature remembering its name. I spent the rest of the morning by the water's edge, sketching the reflections of windows, bridges, the faint ripple where sunlight trembled. Every drawing became an argument between structure and surrender. You want lines to stay, but the world keeps moving. By afternoon the clouds thickened, the kind that smell like tin and time. I made my way back through the narrow cale, passing open shutters where families lingered over lunch. Someone played a radio old enough to still believe in love songs. I stopped beneath the balcony of an abandoned palazzo where ivy had begun to climb back into relevance. Its once grand door leaned like a man tired of keeping promises. And then, without reason, I remembered his voice. "You'll come to the festival, won't you? Just to listen." I had shaken my head then. I already know her words. He had looked at me the way lawyers look at witnesses who have said too much. I pressed my hand to the damp wall now and felt the cold travel through skin to bone. A church bell somewhere began its minor confession. I thought of the poet's poster, her eyes printed larger than mercy, the tagline, "The Return of Light." How fitting, and how cruel. By dusk, the sky bruised into lilac again. I took the ferry back to my workshop. The furnaces were still, dark hearts cooling under layers of ash. I walked through the aisles, touching the mouths of vases that glimmered faintly in the low light. Glass, I've learned, carries memory like a second skin. Touch it, and you can almost hear yesterday whisper. On the workbench lay his empty coffee cup. I hadn't moved it. The ring it left had dried into a perfect circle, ghost of a conversation. I traced it with one finger and laughed quietly. You never were good at cleaning up. In the silence that followed, something shifted, not outside, but inside me, a hinge I realized that perhaps healing is not forgetting, but remembering without reopening the wound. I locked the doors, let the key hang on its nail, and crossed to the pier. The air was colder now, the kind that bites gently to remind you you're alive. Across the lagoon, lights bloomed like small suns over Venice. Somewhere among them, he was probably waiting for the poet's plane, rehearsing smiles, convincing himself it was closure. And me. I watched the water calm and dark, and whispered to no one in particular, "Some things are beautiful only when they cool." The tide answered in small ripples. I took that as agreement. The first posters appeared on the mainland 2 days later. A white wall near the Vaporetto stop, blank and echoing, now carried her face half shadow, half light. Beneath, in black serif letters, "Lucia Moreau, The Return of Light." I had seen that face before, but smaller, on his bookshelf, on the cover of a collection titled Saltwater Psalms. Now it looked at me as if it were aware of what it had once taken. By mid-morning the island was a rumor of motion, tourists ferrying in, glassblowers pulling shutters open like eyelids. I stood by the furnace door, trying to decide if art was still possible when your chest feels full of sand. The answer, I knew, was yes, but never the same kind of yes. The door creaked. "Good morning," he said, quieter than before, as though the word itself was an apology. I didn't look up. "Morning." He placed a newspaper on the bench. "She's here." I kept turning the pipe. "She asked about you." That stopped me. "Why?" My voice came out thin. He rubbed his thumb along the newspaper's edge, not meeting my eyes. "Because she saw the chandelier mock-up in the journal. She remembered the way you use light." I laughed once, without mirth. "She remembers everything that flatters her." He flinched. I almost regretted saying it. "She doesn't know," he murmured. "About us? About now? She doesn't need to." I lifted the gather again. "Some things only exist while they're breaking." He watched me work, the silence between us turning glassy. "She invited us to her reading," he said. "Tomorrow evening, us," he hesitated. "You, if you want." "I don't," I said, too quickly. The heat licked my wrists. "Go." He nodded, the way people nod when they've already made peace with being unwelcome. I expected him to leave, but he didn't. He watched the orange light bloom on my face, and in that light he looked younger, almost kind again. "She asked me to bring something to show her," he said. I didn't ask what. I thought maybe he gestured toward the shelves of finished pieces. "Something from your work." "No," I said, softer this time. "She already has enough of what was mine." He swallowed, nodded again, and left. When the door shut, the air trembled, and I realized how still I'd been standing. The furnace roared, but all I could hear was the faint rhythm of memory waves against stone. Words that had once been his prayers to her. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the open window of my small apartment above the workshop. The lagoon stretched out black and infinite, scattered with coins of light. From the mainland, I could see the faint pulse of the festival's tents, like fireflies gathering for judgment. I took out saltwater psalms from the shelf. I had promised myself never to open it, yet my hands did. The pages smelled faintly of sea and paper dust. Her handwriting was delicate, each letter looped with precision that bordered on arrogance. Halfway through, I found it the poem he had once read aloud, saying, "This saved me." It was about a storm, a rescue, a voice guiding him out of darkness. I searched for myself in the lines and found nothing. No color of glass, no island, no word that might mean me. The last stanza read, "I saw a man's surface, carrying light between his teeth, and when he opened his mouth, I called it love." I shut the book. Down below, the furnaces clicked as they cooled. In the silence, my chest filled with something that wasn't jealousy. Not quite grief, either, something quieter and more persistent, like the ache left by lifting too much. I began to write, though I hadn't written in years. Not a poem, not exactly a sketch of words the way I sketch faces, to see what shape truth might take. He was made of salt and silence. I was made of fire and patience. He thought light belonged to the sea. I learned it could be trapped in glass. The pencil tip broke. I let it. Outside, a foghorn moaned. Venice slept. The lagoon breathed. And somewhere across the water, a woman recited a poem to an audience that would never know the sound of his apology. The festival spilled across Venice like perfume too sweet, too insistent, impossible to ignore. Every bridge was dressed in banners. Every cafe spoke in half-quoted poems. The air smelled of paper, ink, and longing for something that never really happened. I stayed on. I told myself I was working, but really I was hiding. The chandelier commission deadline loomed. The piece had to be finished before the equinox exhibition. I named it Vigilance, though no one asked me why. Perhaps because that's what love becomes after. It stops being shared, a watchfulness, a quiet staying awake. The first few hours went well. The rhythm of the furnace calmed me. Open, gather, roll, breathe. But art is honest. It catches the tremor under your skin. By midday, every bubble refused to center. Every curve sagged a little too soon. The glass reflected the blue hour before it even arrived. At 4, the sky began to dim, the kind of dim that doesn't mean night yet but carries its scent. I stepped outside for air. The canal water bruised into cobalt. Somewhere across it, the mainland lights flickered to life, and I wondered which one was the hall where she would read tonight. Inside, the radio on the shelf crackled. I never turned it on. My apprentice sometimes forgot to turn it off. But now it hummed softly, as if choosing this moment to wake. A news anchor's voice drifted out, bright and shallow, followed by applause and, then unmistakably hers, Lucia Moreau. I froze. The radio caught her mid-sentence, and when I write about the sea, she was saying, I'm writing about memory, what it carries, what it refuses to release. Every wave is a kind of forgiveness. Forgiveness? The word stung. I stood very still, glass tongs in hand, listening to her voice travel across the air like a phantom tide. She sounded exactly as she had on recordings, graceful, deliberate, aware of her own gravity. And some people, she continued, teach us that beauty is not meant to be kept. They hold a light just long enough to remind us we are capable of it. Applause again. I imagined him there, front row perhaps, his expression the same as when he read her poems aloud in my kitchen, part reverence, part ache. I turned off the radio. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, molten. I could almost see it settling in the corners. I worked until night fell, until my arms trembled and the glass began to wobble in sympathy. When I finally stopped, the chandelier stood half-finished on the stand, 12 arms, curving upward like questions with no answers. In the quiet, I realized I'd made something that looked almost like prayer. I locked up the workshop and walked to the pier. The fairy lights shimmered, and I caught my reflection in the dark water, pale, tired, a woman trying to keep her own flame alive. On impulse, I took the smaller boat that ran late to the mainland. It was nearly empty, just me, the driver, and 2 students sharing earbuds. The wind had teeth. Venice was louder than I remembered. People spilled from the theater in waves, talking, laughing, arguing about metaphors. I didn't have to ask which event had just ended. The posters were everywhere, her face luminous under streetlights, next to words that now tasted bitter. Return of light. I kept my distance, standing beneath an awning, watching as the crowd thinned. And then I saw him. He emerged from the doors last, the same coat, the same thread at the cuff. Eyes brighten that way hope makes you foolish. She walked beside him, her scarf a flare of crimson against the dusk. They were talking, laughing softly, the kind of intimacy that forgets the world. He reached out once, just to steady her on the step, and I saw his hand hover, hesitate, then drop. A hesitation that said everything's still tethered, still not free. I turned away before they could see me. My throat felt full of glass dust. The next ferry left in 15 minutes. I walked fast, each step echoing like a decision. Somewhere behind me, someone called his name. I didn't look back. The lagoon wind carried a faint trace of applause. Maybe memory, maybe just the sea breathing. When I reached Murano again, it was past midnight. I didn't light the furnace. The air was cold enough to set everything in me still. I stood before the unfinished chandelier and whispered, "She may write about forgiveness, but she never had to practice it." And for the first time in months, I cried not from heartbreak, but from understanding how much of myself I had poured into something that could never hold water. Outside, the tide whispered against stone, and I thought, perhaps it's time to let this island cool. The next morning began in a silence too complete to trust. The furnaces had cooled more than I intended. When I opened the heavy door, a faint shudder ran through the metal like a held breath released too late. The temperature dropped below working heat, which meant I would have to start again slowly, carefully, coaxing fire back into obedience. It felt appropriate. Everything between us was cooling too. I spent the morning feeding the flame layer by layer, whisper by whisper until it caught. The first rush of orange always startled me, the way love once did. Sudden, bright, promising. I left the furnace door ajar, and began sorting through the shelves of finished work. That's when I found the letters. They were hidden behind a crate of color bars I hadn't touched in months, tied with plain twine. My name was on the top one, written in his handwritings, mal neat. The kind of handwriting that believes words should behave. There were 3 envelopes. One dated from the spring we first met, another from last year's winter, and one, yesterday. For a long moment, I just stared at them, the twine biting faintly into my thumb. The furnace hummed behind me, waiting. I opened the oldest first. You said glass remembers. I think memory does too. I wanted to write before I could speak it wrong. When you breathe into the pipe, the air changes shape, but it's still your breath does love work that way. Maybe this will break, but I'll write it anyway. He had written those words before we were anything more than curiosity and conversation. I remembered that day he'd come to the workshop with a cracked bottle, stayed for an hour, left with my laugh caught in his sleeve. The second letter was different, colder, more precise. You once told me the hardest part of your work is letting glass cool. I think I understand that now. Every time I leave you to return to the mainland, I feel like a piece that wasn't annealed long enough. The final envelope, the one dated yesterday, was heavier. I hesitated before opening it. The paper smelled faintly of coffee and sea. She read her poems tonight. I thought I'd feel something, but I mostly felt absence. She's real, yes, but only in past tense. I kept thinking of you standing by the furnace, hair lit from behind. I didn't call because I knew words would sound smaller than they are on paper. If you ever read this, I'm on the 10 a.m. ferry tomorrow. If you want to talk, come. I folded the page carefully and looked at the clock. 9:43. The pier was a 10-minute walk if I hurried, but my hands wouldn't move. I looked at the letters again, his breath, trapped on paper, and felt something inside me resist, gently but firmly, like glass refusing to take another shape. I walked to the furnace instead. The heat pressed close, steady, familiar. I placed all 3 letters on the long steel paddle, slid them into the mouth of the kiln, and watched the edges curl. For a moment the handwriting glowed white, then vanished, turning to a thin, twisting smoke that smelled faintly of salt and ink. There was no anger in me, only quietness. When I pulled the paddle back, the paper was gone. But in its place, a trace of soot had settled on the brickstry, faint gray shadows, like ghosts sitting down to rest. I whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. The flame hummed in reply. Outside, a gull cried once and was silent. I imagined the ferry pulling away from the dock, his coat lifting in the wind, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him. For the rest of the day I worked without music, shaping new pieces from old, glass melting, blending, transforming what had already lived another life. The colors came out strange and beautiful, amber fading into pale blue, fractures turning to veins. By evening, I realized I had made something unplanned, a small bowl, clear at the base, but deepening into ocean at the rim. It caught the last of the light and held it steady. I decided to call it closure. When I set it on the shelf, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally taken a form I could hold. The morning after the letters, the island felt rearranged. The gulls seemed quieter, the canals slower, and even the air between the glass shops hung heavy with something unspoken. I told myself it was weather, not omen. Still, I lit the furnace early, as if light itself could keep regret from returning. When the first glow reached working heat, I began assembling the chandelier again. Each arm of glass curved upward in a delicate arc, meeting at the center like a prayer. I moved carefully, almost tenderly, afraid that even my breath might unmake what little steadiness I'd found. Around noon, the doorbell chimed. I froze. No one visited without notice anymore. When I turned, he was there. He stood in the doorway, coat undone, hair damped with sea air. In his hand was the book of poems, saltwater psalms, bent at the edges, rain smudged. "Human?" I waited. He said simply, "I know." My voice came out even. I didn't. He looked down, smiled faintly, a man cataloging every consequence of his choices. I deserved that. He stepped inside but didn't cross the chalk line that had long ago become instinct between us. The room filled with the sound of the furnace breathing. "She's leaving tonight," he said. "Paris." She wanted me to go with her, and I told her no. I turned back to the chandelier, adjusting a joint that didn't need adjusting. That must have surprised her. She said I was wasting my life on an island. "Maybe she's right, maybe," he said. "But it's my life to waste." The words hung between us, raw and unadorned. I wanted to ask if he came for absolution or merely witness, but my throat refused the question. He looked around the workshop, the tools, the fragments, the glow of half-finished beauty. "I read what I wrote," he said. "All those letters? They sounded truer than I deserved. You burned them, didn't you?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. He exhaled softly. "Good. I think I needed that more than you did." For a while we just listened to fire, to memory, to the strange comfort of having nothing left to hide behind. Finally he said, "I came to tell you I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not choosing you sooner." I smiled at that, a small, tired smile that felt like forgiveness but wasn't. "You didn't have to choose. You just had to stay." He closed his eyes briefly, as if memorizing the sound of what he'd lost. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "If I stay now?" I shook my head. "Then you stay as someone who finally understands distance." He stepped closer, just one pace past the line. The air changed denser, older. "You're still angry," he whispered. "No," I said. "I'm still here." "That's different." He reached out, fingertips hovering above my sleeve. The gesture trembled, uncertain. "Let me help you finish it," he said, nodding toward the chandelier. I hesitated, then handed him the small metal hook used to anchor the arm. His hand brushed mine, heat meeting heat, both unsteady. We worked in silence, threading glass to wire, linking each arm with deliberate patience. The light from the furnace swelled around us, soft and forgiving. When the final piece was in place, I stepped back. It was beautiful, more so than I expected, but it was also fragile in the way honesty always is. He looked up, breathing shallow. "It's like the sea caught fire." "It's meant to look that way," I said. "Something impossible made visible." He nodded, then whispered, "I think that's what we were." The moment could have lasted forever, But forever is a luxury truth doesn't allow. I turned off the gas line. The flame shrank, flickered, died. The room filled with the quiet of cooling. He stood there a moment longer, eyes following the fading glow. You're not coming to the pier, are you? I didn't think so. He smiled then gently, without bitterness, and placed the book on my bench. You can throw this in the furnace too, if you want. I looked at the book, then at him. No, I said. Some things don't need fire. They just need to stop being carried. He nodded, slipped his hands into his pockets, and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back once, as if to confirm I was still real. You made beauty out of the hardest material, he said softly. Maybe I was never meant to hold it. Maybe, I said. But you were part of its making. The door closed behind him, and the sound was softer than I expected, like a breath released. I looked at the chandelier. The glass arms still shimmered from residual heat, faint fractures running beneath the surface. But when the light passed through them, the cracks didn't ruin the glow. They multiplied it. I realized then that not all damage is destruction. Some of it is simply how light finds a way in. The evening of the exhibition came with a rain that fell like silk, thin, persistent, indifferent. Venice shimmered under umbrellas and reflections. The Palazzo Soranzo, where my chandelier was to be unveiled, stood gleaming like a secret too beautiful to stay hidden. Inside, the gallery smelled of varnish, lilies, and human expectation. People drifted through rooms whispering about color, technique, and priced the holy trinity of admiration. I stood near the entrance, half invisible in my black dress, pretending to study a catalog I'd already memorized. I hadn't invited him. I hadn't needed to, because I knew him well enough to know he would come. The chandelier hung in the center of the vaulted hall, 12 glass arms spiraling upward in amber and ocean hues. When the lights dimmed, it came alive, the fractured seams scattering illumination like rain through sunlight. Gasps rose from the crowd. Someone murmured, "It looks alive." Someone else said, "It looks like heartbreak suspended." They weren't wrong. I drifted closer, listening to the quiet hum of admiration, the small polite applause. The curator approached, a kind man with too much cologne and genuine kindness in his eyes. "Signorina Lin," he said. He could never pronounce my full name right. "Congratulations. The centerpiece is extraordinary. Thank you." My voice felt detached, as though borrowed from someone else. He smiled. "You've captured the essence of the exhibition theme, rebirth through fracture. People will remember this piece, rebirth, a word that promises everything and delivers exhaustion." The curator excused himself to greet donors. I turned away and caught a movement near the back of the room, a familiar silhouette, half-shadowed, unmistakable, pacing Tren. He was there. He looked different, or maybe just more real than the idea of him I'd carried. His coat still bore that frayed thread, his hands buried in pockets. And beside him, of course, stood Lucia Moro. She was radiant in that effortless way of people who believe they've never truly lost. They were speaking softly, heads inclined, as if the world existed only for their conversation. My stomach tightened, then steadied. I stayed where I was. The chandelier above them caught the light at just the right angle, sending a wave of blue gold across their faces. For 1 second, it looked as if the whole hall was underwater, 2 figures trapped inside the same tide. Lucia looked up, her eyes meeting mine across the distance. Recognition flickered, brief but unmistakable. She smiled, graceful, almost kind, but with that faint curiosity artists reserve for other artists. "So, this is the woman who built the fire he couldn't extinguish." She leaned toward him, said something I couldn't hear. He turned, followed her gaze, and our eyes met. There was no startle, no guilt, just that quiet heaviness of shared knowing. He took a step forward, then stopped. His lips moved, forming my name, but the sound was swallowed by applause as the gallery lights shifted for another unveiling. I took the moment as mercy. When the applause faded, they had already turned away, speaking again, the conversation resuming like a thread, never broken. I exhaled and let the noise of the crowd fill the space where memory once lived. Later, after the guests began to thin, I walked beneath the chandelier one last time. The glass still glowed faintly from the heat of so many lights. I reached up, fingers grazing one of the arms, warm, fragile, alive. It was beautiful, and it didn't need him to see it for it to remain so. I smiled, barely, and whispered, "You're whole now." The chandelier didn't answer, but a bead of condensed water slid down one of its arms and fell onto my wrist. It felt like blessing or farewell. The rain didn't stop that night. By dawn, Venice felt washed hollow. The festival banners hung limp, the canals glassy with exhaustion. I hadn't slept. The chandelier still glowed in my mind, its fractured arms bending light like forgiveness refusing to fade. I packed slowly. Not to run, just to breathe somewhere else. There's a difference. The gallery had offered to keep vigilance as a permanent exhibit. They said it embodied resilience. I smiled politely. If only they knew what resilience actually costs. By mid-morning, I took the ferry to Burano, the quieter sister of Murano. Fewer tourists. More fishermen, colors bright enough to lie about sorrow. I carried a small bag, my sketchbook, and nothing of him. The ferry rocked gently, its rhythm almost maternal. The water smelled clean after the storm. I stood at the rail, hair pulled back, feeling lighter and stranger than I had in months. Halfway across the lagoon, a message arrived on my phone. A single line from him. "I saw your chandelier again this morning. It's beautiful. I hope you're proud." No questions, no pleas. Just that. I typed "thank you," then deleted it. The cursor blinked, a heartbeat of indecision, before I turned the phone off and slipped it into my coat pocket. The ferry horn sounded a low, forgiving note. Burano greeted me with color, pinks, yellows, blues too hopeful to survive elsewhere. I rented a small room above a lace shop, the kind that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The landlady, a widow with hands like folded maps, asked no questions when I said I only needed a week. That first afternoon, I walked until my feet forgot the rhythm of waiting. I stopped by the edge of the pier where the fishermen mend their nets. One of them offered me a cigarette. I took it, though I never smoked. The paper crackled, the ember small but steady like courage, trying to remember itself. He asked where I was from. "Murano," I said. He nodded. "Ah, glass. Fire?" "Yes," I smiled. "And sometimes, smoke." He laughed, a sound simple enough to feel safe inside. That evening, I sat by the window, sketching the horizon. The light there was different, less theatrical, more honest. I drew shapes that didn't need to become anything. Waves, hands, a bowl half full of air. As the sun lowered, its reflection cut across the lagoon, scattering into tiny mirrors. For a heartbeat, it looked like my chandelier floating on water. I didn't cry, not anymore. Grief, when understood, becomes texture. I whispered to the horizon, "He'll forget, and that's all right." And for the first time, I meant it. The week passed quietly in Burano, as if time itself had decided to rest. Each morning began with the scrape of nets and the smell of coffee drifting through thin walls. The rhythm was simple. The fishermen left, the sea returned, and the light kept its promises. I found myself waking early not to work, but to watch. There's a grace in stillness, in realizing nothing is demanding you to create beauty. Beauty simply happens. On the 8th day, I returned to The ferry cut through fog so thick, it turned the lagoon into milk. I stood at the bow, hair damp, heart calm. When the island emerged, it felt smaller, almost shy. My workshop waited exactly as I'd left it, dust soft on the benches. The furnace cold but patient. I opened the shutters. Light poured in. The chandelier was still there, suspended in the center, catching the morning sun like a frozen wave. The gallery had returned it after the exhibition, saying it deserved to hang where it was born. I walked beneath it, fingertips tracing the air just below its lowest arm. The fractures gleamed softly, lines of silver instead of scars. Then the door opened. Pacing Tren stood there hesitant, holding his hat like a schoolboy caught in rain. "I heard you came back," he said. "Only for a while." He nodded. "I went to Of course you did," I said. "You always arrive when there's nothing left to say." He smiled, faintly. "Then let me say it anyway." He stepped closer, the smell of the sea following him. "Lucia's gone. Back to Paris." She's working on a new book about silence, ironically. Silence suits her. It suits you better, he said quietly. I didn't answer. I turned to the chandelier instead. Light was sliding down its glass like slow rain. He followed my gaze. It's different in daylight. Yes, I said. Daylight doesn't forgive. It just tells the truth. He took another step. I came to tell you something honest. I waited. I loved her, he said. But it was a kind of love that feeds on distance. It dies when you touch it. He hesitated, eyes steady on mine. With you it was the opposite. I didn't know how to love something I could actually reach. His words were gentle, stripped of plea, almost tender in their surrender. I felt neither triumph nor pain, only clarity, like the moment glass cools enough to keep its shape. I believe you, I said, and that's enough. He looked startled. Enough? Yes. Because believing doesn't mean keeping. For a long moment we stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the island. Then he said, You're not staying. No. Where will you go? Maybe Florence. Maybe nowhere. I'll find a place with less salt in the air. He laughed softly. Then I hope it rains sometimes, so you remember the sea. I will. He set the hat down on the bench, a gesture of final courtesy. If you ever need anything, I won't, I said gently, and meant it. He nodded once, eyes shining not with sadness, but release. You taught me something. What's that? That forgiveness isn't about returning. It's about walking away without hate. I smiled. Then learn it well. He hesitated at the door, then said, Your chandelier, it's the most honest thing I've ever seen. That's because it stopped pretending to be whole, I said. He lingered, then turned and stepped into the fog. The door closed with a sigh, and the sound blended with the sea outside, soft final kind. I stood beneath vigilance a long time, watching sunlight fracture into colors on the floor. Each color moved, but none collided. When the clock struck noon, I blew out the last ember in the furnace. For once, the silence felt like home. 3 months later, Florence arrived like a sighworm, sun-stained, generous with its afternoons. I found a small studio near the Arno, above a bookstore that smelled of rain and forgotten hands. The walls were old enough to remember laughter, the windows wide enough to forgive. I didn't rebuild a furnace. Not yet. The city already burned in its own ways. Terracotta rooftops catching dusk, gold light pouring through narrow lanes. Instead, I filled the space with sketches, fragments, small bowls of colored sand that waited without expectation. People sometimes asked if I missed Mar. I'd smile and say, You don't miss fire, you. Thank it and move forward. At night, I walked along the river, watching how bridges stitched light to water. Sometimes, couples leaned on the rails, whispering promises I used to believe in. Sometimes, I stopped beneath the statue of Dante, who also learned what it meant to walk through hell and still call it art. One evening, a courier left a package at my door. No name, only a return address. Venice Soranzo Gallery. Inside was a small parcel wrapped in linen and a note in the curator's hand. Signorina Lynn, the chandelier has been purchased by a collector in Paris. He requested it be titled in its original language Vigilant. We thought you should know. I unfolded the linen. A single shard of blue glass rested within, curved like a tear frozen midair. The light from my window caught it, scattering fragments across the room. Paris. The word didn't hurt. It simply existed, like weather on another continent. I placed the shard on the windowsill where the sun could reach it. When the light passed through, it painted the room in the same hue as the sea between Murano and Burano, something that remembered both distance and calm. That night I lit a candle beside it. The flame wavered, leaned, and steadied. I watched the glass glow faintly, as if it were remembering. Maybe it was. Maybe we both were. I whispered, Keep the flame. And for the first time, the words didn't mean waiting. They meant living. Outside, the bells of Florence began their slow song, carrying through the open window. Each note felt like an answer I no longer needed but was grateful to hear.